Story number 1. The Vanishing Room. The apartment wasn't anything special, but to Amelia it felt like a step up. It was her first place alone, a quaint 2-bedroom on the edge of downtown. The landlord had been eager to rent it out, dropping the price without much negotiation. "You won't find anything like this around here," he had promised, strangely avoiding eye contact. The first few weeks were uneventful. She decorated the space, hung up fairy lights, and enjoyed the quiet. But then things started to feel off. It began with a subtle change. One evening she walked into the spare bedroom to grab her sketchbook, and the room felt smaller. The difference wasn't dramatic, but the proportions seemed wrong. Her desk, normally flush against the far wall, was now awkwardly closer to the door. She brushed it off, thinking she must have nudged it while cleaning. Days passed. The walls in the spare bedroom continued to feel closer than before. Amelia swore she hadn't moved the furniture, yet everything seemed slightly rearranged each time she entered. The small window that overlooked the street was no longer where she remembered it. It had shifted an inch or two to the left. She told herself she was imagining things, but her unease grew. One night, as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone, she heard the unmistakable sound of furniture dragging across the floor. Startled, she froze, her heart pounding. The noise was coming from the spare bedroom. Amelia grabbed a flashlight and edged her way down the hall. The air was colder near the door, biting against her skin. Inside, the room was almost unrecognizable. The walls were claustrophobically close now, leaving barely enough space for the desk and chair. Her belongings seemed smaller, as if they'd been shrunken to fit. She backed out, locking the door behind her. The next morning, she called the landlord, but he didn't pick up. Her texts went unanswered. Desperate for an explanation, she scoured online forums about strange architecture, shifting spaces, and haunted apartments. Most threads ended in laughter or shrugged off superstition, but one comment caught her attention. "Rooms that shrink aren't shrinking. They're closing in, pulling you towards something. Don't stay." Amelia decided to avoid the spare bedroom altogether. Days turned to weeks, and she tried to live her life as normally as possible. But the sounds didn't stop. The dragging furniture, the faint scraping of the window pane. She was certain now that the room wasn't just smaller, it was changing. Every night the walls seemed closer, the air colder, and the space darker. Finally, the inevitable happened. One evening, as she was brushing her teeth, the light in the hallway flickered and went out. She heard the familiar dragging noise, but louder this time, as if the walls themselves were groaning. And then, the door to the spare bedroom creaked open. Amelia stepped back, trembling, clutching her toothbrush like it could somehow ward off whatever was inside. The room was pitch black, its dimensions impossible to discern. Her flashlight didn't pierce the darkness. It was as if the light was absorbed by the void. Then something moved. A faint shuffling sound echoed from the room. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she was frozen, drawn to the doorway like a moth to a flame. She took a hesitant step forward. Her phone vibrated, an incoming call, but she ignored it, too terrified to look away. As she reached the threshold, the blackness inside the room shifted. It wasn't empty, it was alive. Shadows coiled and twisted like smoke, forming shapes that were almost humanoid but unnervingly wrong. Eyes glimmered faintly, watching her. And then came the whispers, low and guttural, speaking a language she couldn't understand. Amelia stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow. She turned to run out of the apartment, but the hallway stretched endlessly before her. The walls were no longer the familiar beige but dark, cracked and pulsing as though they had veins. Every door, every window was gone, swallowed by the nightmare. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The spare bedroom door creaked open behind her, impossibly wide now, leading to nothing but void. The whispers grew louder, echoing through her mind. She felt herself being pulled toward the darkness. The apartment, her home, everything was consumed by it. And then silence. The space was still, empty. Amelia was never found. The landlord rented out the apartment again a month later. The new tenant commented on the great deal and asked about the strange proportions of the spare bedroom. The landlord simply smiled and handed them the key. Story number 2. Beneath the floorboards. It started with a faint sound, a tapping, barely audible, coming from somewhere deep beneath the floor. I told myself it was just the old house settling. I'd only moved in a week ago, and everything about the place felt unfamiliar, worn, and slightly off. The landlord had warned me the house had its quirks, but for the price, it couldn't argue. By the third night, the tapping had grown louder, and now it came in bursts, rapid knocks, followed by silence. I pressed my ear to the floorboards in the living room, trying to pinpoint the source, but the moment I got close, it would stop. It was maddening. I considered calling an exterminator, thinking it might be mice or raccoons in the crawl space, but something about the sound felt deliberate, too rhythmic to be an animal. The next morning, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I pried up one of the loose floorboards in the living room. Dust billowed out, making me cough, but beneath the wood was only darkness. I couldn't see anything but a narrow gap descending deeper than I'd expected. The tapping didn't return that day, so I thought I'd scared away whatever was down there. That night, however, it came back, louder, angrier. The knocking was accompanied by a low moaning sound, like wind gusting through a hollow pipe. I tried to ignore it, pressing pillows over my ears, but sleep refused to come. I felt like the house was breathing, alive and restless. The tapping shifted, moving from the living room to the hallway outside my bedroom. It was faster now, erratic, like it was demanding my attention. At one point, I swore I heard faint whispers accompanying it. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I stormed into the hallway, determined to confront whatever was causing the noise. "Stop it!" I screamed, my voice echoing in the empty house. The knocking stopped instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. That should have comforted me, but it didn't. In fact, the quiet was worse. I stood there trembling, staring down at the floorboards. That's when I saw it. Movement. One of the boards shifted slightly as though something beneath it was pushing up. I ran to the kitchen to grab the crowbar and rushed back. The board was still moving, rocking gently. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity was stronger. I pried up the board in one quick motion, my heart pounding. Beneath the floor was a tunnel, narrow, dark, and impossibly deep. The air that wafted up smelled damp and metallic, like rust and decay. My flashlight beam revealed jagged dirt walls and something else, scratches. Long, deep grooves carved into the sides of the tunnel, as if someone or something had clawed its way up. And then I saw it, a hand, pale, skeletal and twisted, reaching out from the darkness below. It froze under the beam of the flashlight, its long fingers curling slightly, as though recoiling from the light. My scream caught in my throat as the hand disappeared into the tunnel with terrifying speed. I staggered back, dropping the flashlight. The tunnel seemed to inhale, a loud rush of air echoing up from the depths. I scrambled to grab the board and hammer it back into place, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the nails. The knocking resumed almost immediately, frenzied now, accompanied by guttural growls. The tunnel wanted out. The next day I packed my things. I didn't even call the landlord. I didn't care about the deposit. I left the house and drove away, promising myself never to look back. I didn't sleep for days, haunted by the memory of that hand, the smell of decay, and the whispers. A week later, out of morbid curiosity, I searched for the house online. There wasn't much information, but one headline caught my eye. Local legend, the man who lived beneath the floorboards. The article described rumors of a hermit who'd burrowed himself into the foundation decades ago. He was thought to have died in the tunnels, but some claimed he was still there, waiting. I never went back, but sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint tapping, beneath my feet, beneath the bed, beneath the floors of every place I call home. Story number 3, The Last Game. I wasn't supposed to be there. My friends and I had snuck into the old Miller house after dark, despite every warning we'd heard growing up. Stories about the place were legendary, murmurs of disappearances, strange sightings, and rumors that Mrs. Miller had been into the occult. But that's what made it perfect. A creepy house, a group of restless teens, and a Ouija board. It was just supposed to be a bit of fun. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the smell of mildew and rot. The house had been abandoned for decades, but it still felt occupied. The wallpaper peeled like dead skin, and the floors groaned under every step. We set up in the living room, using an old coffee table that had somehow survived the decay. The Ouija board was pristine, as if it had been waiting for us. We found it upstairs in the master bedroom, tucked neatly under the bed, its surface free of dust. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Claire, her boyfriend Jake, and 2 tag-alongs, Evan and Sarah. None of us believed in ghosts, but that didn't stop the nerves. We lit a few candles and placed them around the room, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jake smirked as he put his hands on the planchette. "All right, spirits of the Miller house," he mocked. "We're listening. Show us something." At first, nothing happened. The planchette stayed still, and we all laughed at how ridiculous we must have looked. But then it moved. Just a tiny nudge. "Very funny," Claire said, glaring at Jake, but he swore it wasn't him. None of us admitted to pushing it. The planchette began to glide slowly, deliberately across the board. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with fake bravado. The letters spelled out M-A-R-Y. Sarah gasped. "Mary Miller," she whispered. "That's the name of the woman who lived here, isn't it?" Before we could react, the planchette darted to yes. The air in the room seemed to shift, heavier, colder. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept my hands on the board. It was just a game. It had to be. Jake grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Okay, Mary, what do you want?" The planchette moved again. H-E-L-P. My stomach churned. This wasn't funny anymore. "Maybe we should stop," I said, but Evan shook his head. Come on, it's just getting interesting. What do you need help with? Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. The candles flickered violently as the planchette spelled THEM. Them? Sarah's voice trembled. Who's them? The answer came faster this time, as if the spirit were desperate. THEYWONTLETMEGO. That's when the smell hit, a pungent, acrid stench like burning hair and rotting meat. The candle's flames turned blue, casting an otherworldly glow over the room. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. None of us could. It was like the air itself had turned to concrete, pressing down on us. The planchette jerked violently, spelling out one last message. ITSTOOLATE. And then the room erupted in chaos. The candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. A deafening noise filled the air, like 100 voices screaming in unison. I felt something cold and sharp brush against my arm, and when I looked down, there were deep red scratches appearing on my skin. 3 long lines like claw marks. Someone screamed. I think it was Claire, but I couldn't be sure. The sound was swallowed by the cacophony around us. The planchette flew off the board, hitting the wall with a loud crack. The board itself began to splinter, the wood twisting as though it were alive. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The house was silent. The candles were gone, burned out completely, and the Ouija board lay in pieces on the floor. We stumbled out of the house without a word, running until our lungs burned. No one looked back. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the letters spelling out "too late" and heard the screams echoing in my ears. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but the scratches on my arm said otherwise. The next morning, Claire called. She sounded frantic. "Jake's gone," she said. "I thought he went home after, but he's not answering his phone. His car's still in my driveway." He was never found. Neither was Evan. Sarah stopped talking to us altogether. And me? I moved out of town, far away from the Miller house. But the scratches on my arm never healed. They're still there, faded but visible. Sometimes late at night, I hear tapping on my bedroom window. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. And when I check, there's nothing there but the shadows. Story 4. The Reflection. I always hated the antique mirror in my grandmother's house. It was massive, almost floor to ceiling, framed by ornate curling vines of tarnished silver. She kept it in the hallway, right at the top stairs, where it could catch you off guard when you weren't paying attention. Every time I visited, I felt as though the mirror was watching me. My reflection seemed just a fraction too slow, my movements off by a heartbeat. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited the mirror. I didn't want it, but my mother insisted. "She loved that thing," she said. "She would have wanted you to have it." So there it was, leaning against the wall in my new apartment, too heavy to mount, too strange to fit in with the modern furniture I'd picked out. For the first week, nothing happened. I avoided it as much as I could. I kept my head down when I passed by it, unwilling to meet my own gaze. But one night, as I sat on the couch, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The mirror, which faced the edge of the living room, showed my reflection on the couch. But something else moved in the background, a flicker, a shadow. I turned sharply, but the room behind me was empty. My heart raced as I stared at the mirror. Was it a trick of the light? The reflection of a car passing by? I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. But the unease stayed with me. The next few nights were worse. Every time I looked at the mirror, there was something off. At first it was small, an object in the reflection that wasn't actually in the room. Then the details grew bolder. A faint handprint on the glass that didn't match my own. A silhouette that wasn't mine, lingering just behind me. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to cover the mirror, throwing a thick blanket over it. I felt a strange sense of relief as the tarnished silver frame disappeared from view. For the first time in days, I slept through the night. When I woke the next morning, the blanket was gone. The mirror was uncovered, and the reflection was wrong. Completely wrong. It was still me, standing there in my pajamas, but my reflection wasn't moving. It just stared at me, its face blank and unblinking. I backed away, terrified, but my reflection didn't follow. Instead, it smiled, slowly, unnaturally, a grin too wide for its face. And then it raised a hand and waved. I ran, grabbing my phone and leaving the apartment as fast as I could. I didn't go back until I had someone with me, a friend, strong and skeptical, who laughed at my story and insisted we return together. When we walked in, the mirror was gone. The space where it had leaned was empty, the dust on the floor undisturbed. My friend joked that I must have dreamed it, but I know better. Sometimes late at night, when I catch my reflection in a shop window or a passing car, I swear I see that grin. Story number 5, Mira. It was a rainy Saturday when I first found it, a dusty old Ouija board tucked in the corner of a cluttered antique shop. I hadn't gone in looking for anything in particular, just a way to kill time. But the moment I saw it, something about the board called to me. The intricate carvings, the faded letters, the smooth planchette. I couldn't resist. The shopkeeper gave me a strange look as I paid for it. "Be careful with that one," she muttered, her voice low. I laughed it off, thinking it was just part of the ambiance. That night, alone in my apartment, I decided to test it out. It was just a silly game after all, something to pass the time. I set the board on my coffee table, lit a few candles for effect, and rested my fingertips on the planchette. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice echoing softly in the empty room. For a moment, nothing happened. I felt a wave of embarrassment. Here I was, a grown adult, playing with a toy. But then, the planchette moved, slowly, deliberately, to yes. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't pushing it. At least I didn't think I was. "What's your name?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The planchette spelled out Mira. "Hi, Mira," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Do you need something?" "Friend" was the response. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I swallowed my fear. "Okay, Mira, I'll be your friend." The planchette stopped moving. I waited, but it didn't spell anything else. After a while, I packed up the board and went to bed, chalking the whole experience up to my imagination. That's when the dream started. Every night I'd see her, a pale, dark-haired woman standing at the edge of my bed. Her eyes were sunken, her expression blank, but she never moved. She just watched. I'd wake up drenched in sweat. The image of her burned into my mind. Things in the apartment started to shift. My keys would disappear and reappear in strange places. The candles I'd used during the session would roll off the shelf without warning. Once I heard faint whispering coming from the living room, but when I checked, no one was there. I decided to get rid of the board. I took it back to the antique shop, but the moment I stepped through the door, the shopkeeper shook her head. I told you to be careful, she said. It's yours now. You invited her in. I felt the blood drain from my face. What does that mean? I demanded, but she only shrugged. You'll find out, she said cryptically. I took the board home, unsure of what else to do. That night, the dreams were worse. Mira wasn't just standing at the edge of my bed anymore. She was closer, her cold hand brushing my arm, her whispered words incomprehensible. I could feel her breath on my skin. When I woke up, the Ouija board was sitting on my chest, the planchette placed neatly in the center. I don't sleep much anymore. Mira's always there, watching, waiting. The board won't let me destroy it. I've tried fire, water, even burying it, but it always comes back. My friends think I'm losing my mind, but I know the truth. She's still here, and she doesn't want a friend. She wants something else, something I'm afraid to give.